Locked up for death, true stories from America's death row you were never meant to hear. Before we dive in, hit subscribe, tap like, and drop a comment if you're ready to step into the darkest corners of the American justice system, because once this door closes, there's no turning back. The sirens were already fading when the guards found the bodies slumped against the steel bars. Cell C-19. Death Row. Angola Prison, Louisiana. 46 years old on paper, but his face looked decades older, hollowed out by fluorescent lights and silence. His name was Marcus Bell, and, according to official records, he was still alive at midnight. By morning, he was gone. The report said, natural causes. The interviews said something else. Bell had been locked in a 6x9 concrete cell for 23 hours a day, every day, for 19 years. No phone calls without glass. No human touch. No darkness, because the lights never fully shut off. Guards said he stopped sleeping. Inmates whispered that he talked to the walls. Investigators would later learn he'd filed 3 handwritten complaints in the weeks before his death, each one stamped and ignored. When state police arrived, the warden insisted this wasn't a crime scene. No tape. No photos. Just a mop and a warning to keep moving. But one junior investigator noticed something odd. Bell's mattress had been flipped, the concrete beneath it scratched with symbols, numbers, and dates. Not graffiti. A timeline. As journalists began digging, another name surfaced: Florida State Prison, Rayford. Death row inmate Daniel Hargreave. 34 years in isolation. Scheduled for execution twice, reprieved twice, and now legally invisible. His letters described men rotting in plain sight, men who entered death row sane and left it broken. One letter mentioned Marcus Bell by name. The deeper reporters went, the stranger it became. Medical evaluations sealed. Surveillance footage lost. A psychologist who resigned suddenly after interviewing Bell refused to speak on record. And then there was the policy, an internal rule that allowed death row inmates to remain in solitary confinement indefinitely, even after convictions were overturned. Investigators began to suspect Bell wasn't just deteriorating. He was documenting something. 3 days after his death, a federal court order forced Angola officials to open Bell's storage locker, sealed since his intake in 2004. Inside was a bundle of letters, never mailed, addressed to no one. Each page meticulously dated. Each one describing men who vanished from death row without explanation. But the last envelope was different. It wasn't addressed to the courts or the media. It was addressed to an investigator who had died 5 years earlier. And inside, there was a confession that changed everything. The investigator's name was Thomas Rourke, and according to public records, he died in a single-car crash on a rain-slick highway outside Baton Rouge. Alcohol was blamed. Case closed. But Marcus Bell's letter suggested otherwise. He wrote that Rourke had promised to expose the quiet system inside death row, an unofficial network of policies and punishments designed to break inmates long before the state ever set an execution date. Rourke had been assigned to review Bell's mental health appeals in 2016. What started as a routine evaluation turned into something far darker. Rourke discovered that Bell's psychological assessments had been altered, symptoms downplayed, diagnoses softened, just enough to keep him legally eligible for execution. The same pattern appeared in other files. Angola, Rayford, Texas, Arizona. Different prisons, identical language. Journalists obtained a sealed deposition Rourke gave 6 weeks before his death. In it, he described death row as a slow erasure, where isolation wasn't just punishment, but leverage. Inmates who cooperated stayed sane longer. Those who complained deteriorated faster. Some were transferred. Some stopped being seen. As the story broke, pressure mounted. A reporter received an anonymous call warning her to let the dead stay dead. Another found her car door unlocked, her notes gone, nothing else touched. Inside Florida State Prison, Daniel Hargreave was abruptly moved to a different cell block. His letters stopped. Then came the footage. A former corrections officer, facing unrelated charges, leaked security video from Angola's C-Wing. The timestamp placed it 3 nights before Marcus Bell died. The The video showed guards entering Bell's cell during lockdown hours, something explicitly forbidden. The camera feed cut out for 7 minutes. When it resumed, Bell was on the floor, alive, but unmoving. No medical team was called. The Department of Corrections denied the footage's authenticity. They claimed it was manipulated. But an independent analyst confirmed the metadata was clean. Real footage. Real time. Families of death row inmates began coming forward. Stories matched. Sudden mental collapses. Requests for help ignored. Appeals stalled for decades. One mother said her son went into prison at 22 and now spoke like a child. Another said she was notified of a transfer that never happened. Her son was still listed as alive. She hadn't heard his voice in 11 years. As public outrage grew, a federal inquiry was announced, quietly. No press conference. No timeline. Behind the scenes, investigators requested access to long-term isolation records dating back 40 years. That's when they realized something terrifying. More than a dozen death row inmates across multiple states had no complete incarceration trail. Years unaccounted for. Medical logs missing. Surveillance erased. And Marcus Bell's timeline, scratched into concrete, wasn't just a record of his own decline.
It was a map.
The map led investigators into a bureaucratic maze designed to exhaust anyone who tried to follow it. Transfer orders stamped but never executed. Medical evaluations signed by doctors who denied ever conducting them. Death row inmates listed as stable, within weeks of documented suicide attempts. Every thread pointed back to one conclusion. Isolation wasn't failing the system. It was the system. At the center of the inquiry was a classification program buried deep inside Department of Corrections policy manuals, referred to only by a code. It allowed prisons to designate certain inmates as administrative permanent. Once assigned, an inmate could be held in solitary confinement indefinitely, regardless of overturned convictions, mental competency, or pending appeals. No outside review. No expiration date. Marcus Bell had been flagged under the program 2 years after his arrival. So had Daniel Hargreave. So had at least 9 others whose names never appeared in court filings again. When federal investigators requested interviews, resistance hardened. Wardens invoked security risks. Psychologists declined, citing confidentiality. One official resigned overnight. Another lawyered up and vanished from public view. And then the inquiry nearly collapsed when a key witness was attacked. The former corrections officer who leaked the Angola footage was found unconscious in his home, the video drive missing. Police ruled it a burglary. Nothing else was taken. No suspects identified. Inside Florida State Prison, Daniel Hargreave reappeared briefly. A handwritten note reached a journalist through an anonymous guard. It contained only 2 sentences. They move us when we remember too much. If I disappear, check the old infirmary logs. Investigators did. What they found was chilling. Infirmary records revealed repeated sedative administrations to death row inmates not listed as suicidal or violent. Dosages high enough to induce disorientation, memory loss, and long-term cognitive damage. Administered during lockdown hours. Authorized under emergency protocols that were never reviewed. The goal wasn't execution. It was compliance. An internal memo, finally unsealed by court order, confirmed it. Long-term isolation, paired with chemical restraint, reduced appeals, reduced complaints, reduced media attention. Inmates who could no longer articulate their own defense became easier to manage and easier to forget. Publicly, officials insisted executions were rare and appeals were respected. Privately, the system relied on time.
Decades of it.
Let the mind break. Let the paperwork rot. Let the world move on. Marcus Bell didn't move on. His final letter referenced one last date on the concrete timeline. A date investigators initially dismissed as meaningless, until they cross-referenced it with transfer logs from 3 states. That date marked the last recorded movement of an inmate who, according to official records, never existed. And if Bell was right, someone on death row wasn't just forgotten. They were still there. The inmate's name was erased from public databases, but not from the buildings that held him. Investigators traced the date Marcus Bell carved into concrete to a sealed wing beneath Florida State Prison's old infirmary, a place officially decommissioned after a fire in the 1990s. According to records, it had been empty for years. According to former staff, it was used when paperwork became a liability. A federal judge signed an emergency access order. What they found was not an execution chamber, not a secret torture room, but something quieter and far worse. A single occupied cell. Inside sat a man with gray hair cropped close to his scalp, wrists thin from years without sunlight. He did not know the year. He did not know the charges. He knew only his number, carved repeatedly into the wall with a plastic spoon. He had been moved so many times he believed prisons were dreams. His conviction had been overturned in 1998. No one had told him. Medical logs revealed the truth. The administrative permanent designation had followed him across states, misfiled, reproved, rubber-stamped for decades. Each transfer reset the clock. Each evaluation softened the language. He was never executed because he no longer understood what execution meant. When news broke, officials called it an anomaly, a clerical error, a tragic oversight. But Marcus Bell's letters proved otherwise. His timeline matched 8 other names. Men who entered death row and never reached a courtroom again. Men who outlived their sentences, their appeals, sometimes even their families. Locked up not for death, but for disappearance. Bell died weeks before he was scheduled for a new mental competency hearing, one that could have removed him from death row entirely. His final complaint, ignored like the others, mentioned a meeting with an investigator he believed he could trust. The same investigator whose car crashed off that Baton Rouge highway. The federal inquiry is still ongoing. Files are still sealed. No senior officials have been convicted. Angola remains operational. Florida State Prison still houses death row inmates in isolation, some for more than 30 years. Daniel Hargreave was transferred again. His current location is undisclosed. Marcus Bell is buried in a prison cemetery, his grave marked only by a number. And the man found beneath the infirmary? He is alive, but unable to testify. Doctors say decades of isolation erased key memories, including who did this to him. The system calls that closure. Marcus Bell called it a warning. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, because some stories are still locked away and not everyone wants them found.